introduce Tony Hodgson, who is professor in mechanical engineering, my colleague. He has been here for about 20 years, actually. And most recently, he's the director of the biomedical engineering graduate program and runs a very innovative subgroup there called Engineers and Scrubs, EIS, that puts engineers together with physicians and other medical professionals for, let's say, co-creation and co-design. He's also won a Killam Teaching Prize, so obviously pedagogy is very important, and he is here to talk to us today about a different way of actually documenting what goes on in a design course, so that's the use of dossiers.
Good, thanks very much, Mike. So I just wanted to connect briefly to something that Maura said. So I really appreciate you saying that it's time on the business side to expand connections across the university. We feel very strongly that that's exactly what we should be doing in engineering as well. And in fact, Mike and I are submitting a renewal to the Insert Design Chair application later this year, Design Chair program. And our intent is to submit an application focused on technical product innovation. And you really can't do that unless you're talking to a wide variety of groups. All sorts of topics related to human factors, ethnography, prototyping processes, business processes, are all going to be part of that. So this is just a sort of general invitation to anyone, if you are interested at all in that sort of initiative. It will be very much cross-campus, so please come and talk to Mike or me afterwards. The talk that I'm giving right now is, so Mike asked me to speak a little bit about some innovations that we've introduced into our capstone design project over the past few years. And I think the hope and the intention is that for those of you who teach relatively open-ended design-type activities in many different departments, maybe some of the experiences we've had might be of use to you. So I'm presenting this not as prescriptive, but as hopefully inspirational, and if there are connections to be made, I would love to hear about them. So briefly, the overview here is, I'll tell you a little bit about why we decided to switch to design dossiers and what we used to do for many, many years. I'll tell you a little bit about how those work, and then what we very quickly realized was we needed a different way of evaluating these compared with how we evaluated formal reports in the past. And so I'll tell you about the sort of rubric-based approach that we've been developing. And if I have time, I'll talk about a little bit of analysis on some of the data we've got to see whether professors' perceptions of how students write dossiers correspond with students' perceptions. So I'll wrap up. So the problem that we were trying to address is dissatisfaction with what has been a traditional way of reporting on capstone projects. So in engineering, the process of design is really the professional practice. It's like practicing medicine versus learning about medical science. You do design because that's what you do professionally, but it usually has gotten kind of short shrift in our programs. Historically, and if you look across Canada and across North America, most capstone design projects get evaluated through formal reports. So whether it's once a year or once a term or whatever, students hand in a stack of paper, and it's all, it's a lot of attention to formatting and detail, and that gets evaluated by the professor. If you start thinking about it, that's not really the way things work in practice. And students expressed a lot of dissatisfaction with that. We thought we'd moved roughly 10 or 12 years ago to a better way of doing it, which was a series of shorter formal reports. And here it indicates that there were about 6 that were done, so roughly on a monthly basis throughout the year. But students still didn't like that. These were some of their complaints. They said that there was a lack of fit to specific projects. So at the capstone level, we often have an industrial client or some sort of team competition that the students are basing the project on. And these move at different rates, different paces, they've got different focuses. And so by imposing this kind of fixed schedule, students were always finding themselves out of sync. So the timeline didn't match, and I love this comment from one of the evaluations a few years ago. we made stuff up in order to fit into the reporting format. You were giving us marks for this, we didn't do that in our project, so we just made it up. And so they perceived it as bullshit. And they responded appropriately. So they also find it very time consuming, repetitive, often content that shows up early on, shows up, is sort of requested later, or at least they perceive that it is. And this next comment is really telling. It kept us from the real work. So you can imagine then how frustrated they might be. So they didn't perceive any link between what we were asking them to do for evaluation and real professional practice. With month-long intervals, there can be very significant delays between when they do the work and when they're reporting on it. So they totally forget about it. They don't know what they're writing on because they've forgotten what it was doing. It takes a long time for us to evaluate those, so we come back to it, get back to them weeks later. So the feedback cycle is really pretty poor. There's an offloading problem, so many of you who run team-based projects know this, that some people get given the task of writing the report, and so they're trying to write about what somebody else did. That's a problem. Also means they're not doing all the parts of the project that they're supposed to be doing their learning with. And it was fundamentally disconnected from time management because it wasn't linked in very clearly. So the basic idea that we had was to adopt a more standard professional practice. If you do a problem in industry, you actually create a design dossier. As you work your way through a project, I remember in some companies I worked with, there would literally be bookshelves with binders, and a project might be 4 linear feet of that bookcase. And just every day or week, as things were going along, there would be reports filed into these onto this bookshelf, and that's how people kept track of what was going on. So this is totally standard. I first gave this talk over in St. John's, and so I just was down at the dock and saw this ISO 9001, which is the standards organization, registered company. So I just showed that at the conference. So what we did probably 3 years ago now, I think, or 3 or 4, we replaced the 6 formal reports with what we called phases. So the phases are roughly 2 weeks in duration, plus or minus, it depends. We tried to break down the overall product development process to fit into those 2 terms. And so you can see that in each of these sections, we gave a kind of nominal time allotment to each of them. We said, if you're working in this phase, you should probably be putting in about this many hours. I forget whether these are, I think these are total team hours, so teams of 4. So, the first phase would be about 20 hours per student. So, and then what we were asking them to do was to not have a formal report in each section, but to document what they did in a more organic way. And the anticipated benefits we had from moving towards this approach would be increased relevance by really focusing on the purpose of what they were doing. We told them that this was primarily for the purpose of communicating within their teams, between the team and the supervisor, between the team and the client. So any communication that would be considered somewhat natural to the process was something they should be putting in their design dossier. We anticipated overall there would be more completeness in the documentation associated with the project because it would be generated as they were going. And so there would be less delay, fewer things forgotten. And there was an expectation we had that each student would be writing what they did. And so there wouldn't be so much offloading. We also tried to establish more clear linkages to standard professional documentation. So memos, test procedures, lab reports, photographs of assembly processes, whatever it was that was sort of natural for that phase. And we also gave them more control over the mark distribution, and we linked that explicitly to the time planning process. So I'll give you a quick example of that. So here's an example of phase content, and so this is an early part of the phase, just kicking off. So there are some things that the students are expected to do, and those are listed as tasks. They're kind of generic, but most projects will do this in one form or another. And so the students are responsible for estimating how many hours they're going to spend on this, and for identifying the ways in which they want to document the work they do. And so our goal then is to look at the documentation they produce and provide them with feedback and evaluation. So there was some execution or some practicalities in making this transition. So we had to strip out the relevant parts from all the former instruction about the formal reports, write guide notes. We introduced a number of sort of standard forms to try and reduce the amount of time that they were spending formatting documents. And again, this idea that students are responsible for figuring out how they're going to allocate their time. So we explicitly linked it to the marks distribution. So we had those 900 hours, we made that equal to 900 points. And if students wanted to shift emphasis, they had to tell us at least a couple of weeks in advance of how they wanted to spend their time. And that became a commitment for them. It became a commitment to how the marks for that were going to be distributed. So if they estimated that a particular phase was going to take them 100 hours, they'd commit to that a couple of weeks in advance. And whatever documentation they produced in that time essentially got marked out of 100. And in the end then, if they went over, that was sort of tough. They had to make up that time. So they were given freedom. They could update their time schedule up to about 2 weeks before they moved on. Okay, standard template format. So there were a lot of things that students ended up wanting to report on that we didn't have a standard template for. So we kept it pretty simple. And I like what Maura said about 3 simple words. So the standard template for scientific writing follows this pattern, but it's essentially 4 simple questions. Why, how, what, and so what. The so what is, what is the implication of what you just found for your project? So it's really important for them, before they do work, to understand why they're going to do that in the first place, and then to reflect on it at the end and say, we found something, we did something. What does that mean for our project? So we had them produce documentation with those kinds of headings. And as I said again, this is just a piece of software we use. It's called Smartsheet, and it's a project management tool, but it lets them update the number of hours that they're spending on each time and communicate that to their professor. So I wanted to give you a couple of samples of the dossier submissions just to give you a sense of the variety. So we had things like memos. So they just report on something they did. So it's important when you go and have a meeting with a client to document what happened so that everybody knows what happened there. You can report back to the client and say this is what we discussed and what the action items are. We had short focused reports. This is just a little example. So you can see it's only 2.5 pages, but they did something, they had a reason for doing it, and they wrote it up. And you can imagine that a little report like this could be thrown together in half an hour, right? And it's very timely and relevant. Often you're collating a bunch of information. Well, what's a good way to collate things? Tables of some form. So they're trying to document a series of alternative approaches to solving a particular problem. Or a market assessment report. And here they screwed up because they didn't have the introduction. They didn't tell us why, what they were setting out to do in the first place. But in the end, they came up with a conclusion, and they understood why they did this particular market assessment and what it means for the project. So there's faculty, we canvassed the faculty. Our capstone design project is run by about 6 faculty members. So there's actually a question of uniformity that's quite interesting to deal with. How do you get uniformity of grading across projects that are highly disparate with faculty members with very different backgrounds? And we can talk about that a little bit too. The faculty perceptions, there are positives and negatives. On the positive side, we did generally find the documentation was much more complete. We thought there was improved accountability. I don't necessarily have metrics on all of this, but this was our perception. We did feel that there was better communication in the weekly meetings because students were explicitly thinking about how what they were doing was driving things forward. And that enabled us to give them much more rapid feedback. We could easily read a 2.5-page report in a week, and if the students gave it to us the day before, we could have read that by the time they came to meet with us the next day. On the other hand, what we realized the first year was that we really didn't know how to evaluate all of this. We got tons of information, tons of paper, combination of a mixture between paper and electronic submissions, and it became an administrative nightmare. So I'll talk a little bit about that. It was hard to track submission rates. So students were told that they were expected to hand things in regularly, but there still was often procrastination. And from an administrative point of view, it's actually hard to track submission rate because there's a bunch of stuff that gets submitted in each phase. How do we know that it's all being submitted? That actually got kind of tricky. And it turns out that students actually seem to need deadlines from time to time, or things don't necessarily get handed in. Student comments, there were a lot of positive ones, so students liked it. They helped to develop a clear outline of where we want to be. They appreciated the flexibility of the process, and thought that it really gave the team some direction. Despite all our efforts, however, some students also felt that we were, so we had a lot of fairly detailed suggestions about how to write submissions at various phases. So some students felt like we were demanding that they do each and every step in the suggestions we gave them. So sometimes they said it was a little bit, paint by numbers. And they still said, when the earlier comment about we made it up, they still felt that they had to make things up to fit in. If we mentioned it as a possible dossier element, they felt that they had to do it even if it didn't really apply to their project. So I think students didn't really appreciate the flexibility that we were intending. So not all the dossier steps fit. And then they also perceived by talking to one another that there was inconsistent use of the dossier and guidance between supervisors. So that was an issue. So I think that's a pretty good overview of what we are trying to do with the dossiers. I have additional slides that I can go through if it comes up in the question period. So I'll just very quickly say something about what I've got behind the scenes if you want to talk about it. So the whole question of evaluating dossier submissions, essentially what we did was to use rubrics. And we developed a pretty detailed mapping of the rubrics to the design phases, and we tied it in. Engineering is a professional school, so we have the Canadian Engineering Accreditation Board, and they expect programs to document how students progress through their program. And so we explicitly tie evaluation of the dossier elements to the rubrics that our program is, or to the attributes that our program is expected to demonstrate that our students are being trained in. So we have that, so that's something that I could talk about. And then we also did a brief study on whether students and professors shared perceptions of the dossiers. And I'll just quickly show you this slide, which is essentially a paired difference between what the professor thought and what the students thought. And you see, fortunately, so this is on a 5-point scale, so 2 points is actually a fairly significant disagreement in perception. But the bulk of it is at sort of 0, and the next big peak is, by and large, professors are a little more gracious than the students are, so they're a little harder on themselves. What it works out to in the end is, I think it's 0.25 to 0.44 mean difference between the professors and the students. So this is a good preliminary indication that they're pretty close in perception, but a little bit more work to be done. So, thank you.
Thanks very much.